Bring us again.
Now, the other thing is you have to talk a little louder because at this age of 94, everything's a little dimmer.
Understandable.
Yes.
Can you tell us again where and when you went to medical school?
Yes. I went to the medical school of the University of Cincinnati, and at the end of my sophomore year, I transferred to Harvard Medical School, where I got my degree. And that gave me an opportunity to take some of my training in most of the teaching hospitals in Boston, which was a very gratifying experience. In those days, most of the teaching was bedside teaching. We had contact with the patients. We learned how to approach patients in a proper manner. We never entered a patient's room with a professor until he'd come in and explain to the patient who we were and ask for permission to have us present during the bedside rounds. I don't believe bedside rounds are prevalent today for a whole variety of reasons. And I feel this is rather sad because at that time it was such an important part to learn how to communicate with patients, how to encourage them to tell you their story, because that story was often more important than the physical examination itself.
When did you graduate medical school?
I graduated from Harvard Medical School in 1931. That was an interesting period because Harvey Cushing was still professor of neurosurgery at the Peter Bent Brigham. We had Dr. Sossman, who was an outstanding teacher in radiology. And the students had the privilege of rotating, as I said before, through these various teaching hospitals. And we were exposed to an amazing number of skilled clinicians, good teachers, and men who understood personal patient care.
What did you do after medical school, and what was medicine like then?
After graduation, I might say a word about the residency training program. We hear some complaints today about the hard time that residents have, the long hours and so forth. At the time I started my residency at the Cornell Medical Center, no man, and I might say parenthetically there were no women. There were no women in any of my medical classes at Harvard. The thing that impressed me most was the fact that you had to commit yourself totally. They would not appoint anybody who was married, and that was strictly enforced. This was a system set up by the father of American surgery, William Stewart Halstead of Johns Hopkins. And most of the chairmen of departments of surgery around the country, as these residencies were beginning to emerge, were all graduates of the Hopkins residency system under William Stewart Halstead. During my training at the New York hospital, there were periods when I went as long as 6 months without being outside the hospital in the daylight. It wasn't until I took my surgical pathology under Dr. Foote that I had any time to get out in the evening, because we had no assignments to patients at that time. I remember one thing that interested me particularly is that we were told the way to diagnose cancer of the thyroid was to see cancer cells in the lumen of the blood vessels. which indicated that they had actually circulated through the thyroid. Well, it seemed very evident to me that if you could see them in the lumen of the blood vessels of the thyroid, you must be able to see them anywhere in the body if patients had cancer. And Dr. Eugene Poole, who headed up the private service at Cornell at that time, funded a little research grant for me, and we were able to isolate cancer cells in the circulating blood, which were confirmed by the professor of pathology. Years later, when I'd been in practice and a member of the Boston Surgical Society, a speaker came to address that society, and he described wondering about circulating cancer cells in the lymphatic system. And he, by draining some of the lymph from the thoracic duct, was able to demonstrate what I had been able to demonstrate in the capillaries of the thyroid. William Stewart Halstead was an amazing teacher, a very stern one. I never knew him personally. He was told by a colleague of his in South America that they had found a leaf whose extract seemed to numb nerves. And this interested him, and he asked for samples of this plant, and they made an extract. And in those days, doctors very often took the pill that they were experimenting with themselves. They experimented on themselves first. And he and several colleagues injected this extract into their arm and found indeed it did numb the nerves. And they utilized that, and to make a long story short, Dr. Halstead became addicted to cocaine and never was able to get over the addiction even when he moved to New York. Few people knew this, but he continued to produce and serve as a leading surgeon in the world. This is why I strongly favor the legalization of drugs. I could tell you of patients I've seen who've been on drugs 10, 20 years, but whose lifestyle was normal. No smoking, no excessive drinking, good living habits. You'd never know they were addicted. They've gone through surgical procedures as well as anybody else. I won't get off on drugs or we'll never finish. But that's a little of the early days of residency. We didn't feel abused in any way. One time I was able to get out in the afternoon. The patients on my ward were being covered by another resident. And when I came back in the late afternoon at the dinner table, they were so interested to know what it was like in Manhattan. And I told them the only thing I noticed that women's skirts were shorter. But we were doing what we liked to do. Sometimes we went 48 hours without sleep, but we thought that this was perhaps a usual thing for surgeons, you know, and we were being initiated.
Did most medical graduates go into surgery, or why did you choose to go into surgery?
No, I think, I have no idea of the percentage, but I would guess it would be no more than 30%, if not less. But I was interested in surgery. I think it's an advantage if you know what you want to do when you're a young man, because otherwise you can waste your time training in other fields, and that's not a good thing to do. But at the age of 16, I got a summer job doing urinalyses at a hospital in Cincinnati, and all I had to do was to do the urinalysis and then take the report to the ward and fill the report in there. And that way I saw patients, and I was allowed to go in and watch some operations. I remember one time I was asked by a nurse to pour a little saline from a flask, and I had seen them do that, and I knew you had to pour a little out into a bucket first to wash the rim, and then you poured it into the sterile beaker that the nurse was holding, scrubbed at the table. I did all that very carefully, and then set this non-sterile beaker down on the sterile table. I've never forgotten that. We tend to remember things that are a little outrageous, and that was one of them. But can you shut that off at moments so we can?
Oh, you want me to shut it
Yes.
off?
Sure.
I'm wandering around. That's one of the problems of this, and I can zero in on anything, but
I'm fascinated by your story,
Yeah, no, this
so
is-
I think it's wonderful, really.
Yeah.
Well-
Don't
feel
worry
like you're
about it at
wondering,
all.
you're not.
It's really great, actually. I think what happened in World War II, and did World War II change how surgery was practiced at all?
Yes. All right. A word about World War II. I joined the Navy, and after training off the shore of Maryland, I was in what they call an APA. That was a ship that was half hospital and half combat. We would take the Marines into these assault landings, bring back the wounded, care for them until we could transfer them to a regular hospital ship. I was involved with 11 assault landings right through Eniwetok, starting with Kwajalein. We saw all the terrors of war. We had the dive bombers. When a bomber is 10,000 feet up in the air and starts down at a fleet, the angle is so narrow, everybody on every ship in the fleet is sure that plane is aimed straight at him. When this happened at Eniwetok, one of the officers was so sure that he jumped overboard. The plane's wing hit the king post, it flipped over in the ocean, exploded, and the only person killed was the officer who jumped overboard. But we handled the wounded, and this was the initial wounds. We had been given penicillin. It hadn't been released to the public as yet. It was the small supply available was reserved, I should say, for the military at that time. They felt that was the most important. We learned an interesting thing. Some of these men would come back with wounds, and the corpsmen had been told on the beach to pour penicillin powder into the wounds. It was felt that this would kill any organisms. No one knew much about penicillin at the time. But what happened was that the wounded were often lying on the beach for maybe hours before a boat could get in and rescue them, bring them back to the ship. It was a hot, tropical weather, and these wounds would dry, and the penicillin would harden up with blood and like cement. And they would come aboard the ship with a fever of 102, 103, with no drainage to the wound. So the first thing we had to do was to apply wet dressings and get those wounds draining, bring the temperature down. Then the corpsmen around the Pacific had to all be retrained and told not to pour penicillin into a wound. That was one of the first things that we learned in the handling of casualties. Now,
Did you do surgery while you were serving
Yes, the APA had 2 operating rooms, and we did a lot of emergency surgery on wounded patients. We had these, I don't know whether getting into the description of some of the war incidents is appropriate at this interview, but we did do surgery as indicated before we transferred these wounded to other ships. It was a good experience. I learned a great deal about what human beings can stand and tolerate at that time. Then we were transferred at the end of the war to a hospital based in the States before we were mustered out of the Navy. Now, one thing we did learn or observe was that high-ranking Navy officers, medical officers, had been so involved with administrative duties before the war. Many of them had not seen patients for a long time. They were our superiors, but they had been away from the clinical scene. As a result of that, when we got back to the States, some of these patients had, we'll say, a subtotal gastrectomy, some abdominal operation, and they had Levine tubes routinely placed through the nose into the stomach for constant drainage. And the captain of the hospital, and this was not a single experience, others saw the same thing, knew that if anybody had a tube down, the nasogastric tube, that they were pretty sick. And if they were pretty sick, they might die. And if they died in his hospital, that would look bad on his record. So in making his rounds, even though a patient was a couple of days post-operative, he'd say, transfer this patient to hospital so-and-so. Well, we felt it wasn't in the best interest of the patient, so we would go around in advance, tell the patient that we were going to remove the tube, but that we probably would have to replace it very shortly. We wanted to test them, and we would, and the patient then would be kept in the same bed that they were in, and we reinserted those tubes. That experience, just one of many, which made me feel that impersonal, government-controlled medicine was not good for the country or anybody else. So when I got out of the Navy in the first year, I was all against the Murray Wagner Dingle bill for socialized medicine. My first debate was at the Statler Hotel in Boston before the Massachusetts Nursing Association against a Dr. Frothingham at the Peter Bent Brigham Hospital, who strongly supported socialized medicine. And I remember that heated debate. There must have been 300, 400, 500 nurses in the auditorium. But fired up by my war experience, I felt that way then, and I feel that way today. One of the early problems that emerged after the war was the escalating cost of medical care. It was going through the roof. Industry had always been strong supporters of the medical profession. They understood the free market principles, and when certain bills came up, they usually sided with the professional position. However, they found out as time went on that they were going to have to pay more and more of the hospital costs of their employees. So they sided frequently with positions taken by the federal government because they saw that a wave of the future. The medical profession was not trained, knowledgeable, or motivated to do much about health care costs. Their focus was on taking care of sick people. So as a result of that, those who were in favor of government-financed medical care were having a fairly easy time of it. Now, one thing that the medical profession could have done at the time, but as I say again, they did not feel heavily involved. They hadn't been threatened or warned about the details of what lay ahead. So as a result of that, the waste of money in the utilization of ancillary services was appalling. And that went on for some time, and it triggered a lot of changes that were gradually emerging. For example, it wouldn't be unusual for a resident to get a call from the emergency room nurse saying that they had a patient down there, we'll say, with abdominal pain. And the resident would say, well, get a chest plate, a flat plate of the abdomen, a total blood, an EKG, urinalysis, and when you've gotten those reports, let me know, I'll come down and see the patient. Another thing, now that seems pretty bad. Some of it may even be going on today. Another thing that happened was that people were being advised at all age levels to have an annual physical examination. The American Cancer Society used to run on radio an advertisement, have a yearly checkup and send us a check. The Worcester County National Bank, under the leadership of well, I won't mention names now, but the president, who was a very fine, thoughtful person, wanted to do the best for the employees of the banking system. They had a contract to send their employees, their top management, down to the Lay Clinic in Boston each year for a complete examination, which took 2 days. And I used to run into some of them from time to time, and they'd say, guess what? I'd say, what? They said, we just had our annual physical and everything was normal. Well, that wasn't very surprising because they looked pretty healthy, you know. The American Cancer Society, I sat on that board for 10 or 15 years, most of the meetings in Boston. They supported this annual physical examination. And years later, industry began to catch up with that, and so there were committees set up, and I sat on one of them on the West Coast. This was a business who sold their services to national organizations for reviewing the medical care that their employees were getting and to recommend whether or not these tests and treatments were indicated. And that was a fascinating experience. I sat on that committee maybe for 10 years. And we got a flavor of companies like Hewlett-Packard, the United Mine Workers of America. They were all customers, and we got to see some of the more outrageous cases that way. So medical costs were just scooting up. At Memorial Hospital in Worcester, where I served on the surgical service, the requisition slips for various tests indicated in no way what that test was going to cost. And at some of our grand rounds in the amphitheater, I used to ask the doctors, how many in the room know what an EKG costs? Only maybe one or two hands would go up. Sometimes no hands would go up. It took 2 years to get the administration to change their requisition slips to put the cost on it, so that it was like going to a store and just taking things off the shelf and not knowing the cost. There were a lot of things contributing to the cost. The emerging technology, of course, was one of them. And each new innovation was more expensive than the last one. So in Massachusetts, I'm proud to say that this state, the Massachusetts Medical Society, was one of the leading states, one of the first few to decide something had to be done about that, and they organized Blue Cross and Blue Shield. Dr. Jim McCann from Worcester, he was on the staff at St. Vincent's Hospital, sat on that board, that early board, which was appointed, their members were appointed by the Massachusetts Medical Society. And they set up certain standards as to what was reasonable and what wasn't. We had committees that would review the practice of physicians. And the public liked that. They supported it. And of course, then other states set up a Blue Shield plan. I sat on that board maybe 20 years and chaired it for 8. And I then later was placed on the board of the National Blue Shield plans, whose office was in Chicago. So I had an opportunity of seeing what the experience of other Blue Shield plans was in other states. And they were all more or less experiencing the same thing in one way or another. But people were subscribing to Blue Cross and Blue Shield in large numbers. I can't give you those numbers because I just don't remember them, but we're talking about millions around the country. Now, then after it was seen that the government was moving in to pay some of these costs, but not all, Blue Cross and Blue Shield were paying what was not covered by government programs. And the public showed a very real need for total coverage. And they were beginning to take out Blue Cross and Blue Shield to cover for balances due. And when the insurance companies caught on to that, they got into the market. And there was a lot of competition between the major insurance companies and the Blues. And that, of course, is still going on. Now, as the costs continue to go up as they are today, there's renewed interest in how best to cover them. One of the saddest things about this change that occurred when Medicare was introduced is this. The federal government's position was that there should be no person in the United States who didn't have total insurance coverage. There should be no more free ward patients. I can't speak for the medical profession, but I certainly reflect the opinion of the great majority. We used to get the greatest feeling of satisfaction in taking care of many, many patients in the wards for no remuneration at all. We didn't expect it. It was one of the privileges of the profession. It was one of our assigned responsibilities. And that that left a big hole in our lives. It even changed to some degree the type of young people who were attracted to medicine. Now, a lot of the teaching in those early days was all bedside teaching. There were some done in amphitheaters, it's true. But we had the opportunity of seeing, going in, maybe 2, 3, 4 students with an experienced clinician. We'd hear them talk to the patient's reply. Sometimes we would be asked, what would we do under these circumstances? The patient was very interested in all this. They had given permission. It was a very personal sort of thing. We also could see the difference in the effectiveness of the various clinicians who were taking us on these bedside rounds. Some have what we call, I like to call, people skills. Others did not have them. You wondered why they went into medicine sometime. They seemed a little uncomfortable when they should have been comfortable, you know. So bedside rounds began to, as years went on, become less common. Then they were taken over usually by the senior resident. And the senior resident did a good job, sometimes better than the clinical staff. But the most experienced faculty members began to take less of a role in these bedside rounds. Now it's interesting, after a long hiatus, we find that that medical societies here in Worcester, all around the country, are encouraging doctors to come back in as retirees and do voluntarily take care of some of these patients who have no coverage. When the government said that there should be no free patients in the country, and it should be one standard, the next thing they did was set up another program for those with less money. So that whole thing has been ridiculous from the very beginning. But I won't get off into the political aspects of that. But I must say that the profession lost something that at the time was very dear to them.
You mentioned that physicians were starting to be compensated for care they used to provide for free when Medicare...
Now wait, what?
When Medicare and Medicaid came in, you mentioned that physicians started to become compensated for care that they used to provide for free. And you mentioned that you feel maybe some physicians were going into medicine for the wrong reasons. Is that because they were more compensated?
No, I'm not quite clear about the point you're making.
Okay.
You're wondering if some physicians had gone into medicine
for the money.
For the money.
Because you mentioned you started there, you thought that for the medicine attracted a different type of person.
Oh, I see. There was a little suggestion of that. As a matter of fact, as the environment changes in anything, it's apt to appeal to a different group for a whole variety of reasons. Some might have felt that it was becoming more impersonal. Now, it's very easy to see what's happening today because the government is in here full blast. They're trying to get more control. We know what the president's wife tried to do when he first was elected. And that, of course, that process is still going on in Washington. The insurance companies are in it for any bit of the market they can get. And then the HMOs have come in. And as you know, they basically are owned by large corporations whose goal is to make money, whose goal is to pay the stockholders. And I know a relative of mine who's a doctor, is taking early retirement because he was told he should see a patient every 20 minutes. And he would often like to spend an hour or an hour and a half with that patient. Now, the public is very unhappy with the increasing depersonalization of medical care. They hate it. The clinics are getting crowded, and the waiting periods are getting longer and longer. They feel that the doctor is answering questions over his shoulder as he walks out of the room. And I think that the systems that will restore personalized medical care are going to win out in the end, because that's what people are looking for. And if you hear anybody describing their experience with a doctor today, they're apt to say, you know, I saw him in 10 minutes after I got to his office, you know. That, they didn't say the most skilled doctor in the world was how long they had to wait to see him. And it shows that the emphasis is being placed on some of the wrong issues. So things always have to get worse before they get better. One of the problems that I see emerging, it's here, is the global population explosion. Everywhere you go, I could talk all afternoon on that, the side effects. They've proved all this with rats. You're familiar, I'm sure, with those experiments, but as the density of the population increases, crime goes up, civility goes down, stress goes up, people flee to the suburbs, but this is not what you came here to hear about.
How do you think that medicine can go back to becoming more personalized? What changes would you like to see?
Well, first of all, I think that that covers quite a big field. First of all, we have to have, I think the public are ready for it. They know what they want, and they feel they're not getting it. I think the great majority of physicians would welcome an opportunity to give more personalized care. Getting more physicians would, to keep up with this exploding population, would be very helpful. On the other hand, the fat in the system is amazing. We still have a wasting of ancillary services. Let me just give you an example. I know of this woman because of a working relationship. She does housework for a number of families. She had a physical problem. She lives in Worcester. Her husband, through his business, is in an HMO. She knew, well, say she had problems with headaches. She wanted to see a headache specialist, but under the system of the HMO, she had to see the primary physician. These are the various titles: the family practitioner, the primary physician, the gatekeeper. I hate that term. The gatekeeper first. Now, for this particular company that her husband worked for, the home base for the HMO was in Providence. So he had to leave work to drive her to Providence to see the gatekeeper, and the gatekeeper felt that she needed to see a neurosurgeon or a neurologist, and so they referred her to UMass. So she'd been going back and forth, the husband in and losing days of work. That system is not a decent one. If somebody has a broken leg, they often have to go through the primary physician before they can see the specialist. Well, things like that only the medical profession can solve. They, if they're required under their contracts to practice that way, of course, they will. They'll have to. But many things are going to be in short supply. Water. I was in Dallas last week. There are at least 30 or 40 towns in Texas right now who have a serious water shortage, you see. That just, plains are filled. Roads are choked with traffic. People want to flee the crowded areas to the suburbs to get out of this high-density population. They cut down trees, build a house, then everybody in the family has to have a car to get back into the crowded area where they work. That in itself is causing problems and quite a few deaths, as we know. Now, I'll tell you another, is it all right to move to another subject? I would say that during my professional lifetime, one of the more serious problems that we faced and got involved with, when Medicare came in, the question was, how are we going to train young surgeons? And I have a little paper there that addresses that. I say with some pride that the first organization in the country to take any action on that was the New England Surgical Society. And at one of the meetings, this was discussed, and a committee was appointed to look into this matter. And Bert Dumpy, who used to be a surgeon on the staff at the Brigham, was made chairman of that committee the first year and got it rolling. And then I took the chairmanship when he finished his. The professor of the chairman of the Department of Surgery at the University of Michigan wrote a letter to every chairman in the country asking them what their attitude or their opinion was as to how we could train surgeons. And he let me have all those letters. He loaned them to me, and they went from A to Z. Some surgeons say, as long as I live, no patient of mine will ever have any part of an operation done by a resident, period. Interestingly enough, one of the most sympathetic groups of surgeons was the Mayo Clinic. And I went out there and spent a good part of a week seeing how they were going to do, how they were doing it. The New England Surgical Society, after 2 years, unanimously approved this following statement. It is perfectly ethical for a well-trained surgeon to participate in a surgical operation on a private patient, provided the responsible surgeon is scrubbed at the table. Now, I don't know if you know this little bit of history, but I want to finish this. So, we went around the country talking to various groups. They wanted to know how we did it. At Memorial Hospital, we had been doing that. And the way we did it was very simple. We told the patient that any surgical operation was a team approach. Sometimes it was more important to clamp a bleeding point. Other times it's more important for the resident to clamp it and the responsible surgeon to tie the knot, just to use a simple example. Sometimes exposure of an area was more important than doing what you did once the area was exposed. Furthermore, these men, we had to know were well trained. We had to know before they did anything that they have seen this enough times to do it capably. The other thing that was very important is the patient needed to know all about this in advance. And Davis and Geck, did you ever hear of them? They make catgut. At the time, they're the leading company one of the leading companies in the United States that manufactures surgical sutures. Davis and Geck sent their photographers to Memorial Hospital to see this from the very beginning. So I picked a woman who needed a cholecystectomy. And I told her, I asked her permission if we could photograph this whole thing. And she said she would be very happy to participate. I said, I want you to ask any question that you can think of. I don't want to prepare you in any way. There's just one question I want you to ask me directly in front of the camera. Who is going to do my operation, you see? So we could answer that question. And then I would explain that this is a team effort, that we're all going to be involved. We all have parts of it that we will do. I will be responsible for everything that is done. And in order to test that, I used to ask the referring physician to come into the operating room and watch the operation. And at the end of the operation, I would ask them, now, who do you think, who would you say did that operation? And he'd pause, he'd say, well, I guess you all did. And I said, yes, that's what we did. The thing that encouraged me more than anything else was that while all this was going on, operating room nurses who saw this all day in and out would refer their families to us for surgery, knowing exactly how it would be done, you see. Well, when we first published that statement, when the New England Surgical published that, it caused quite an uproar. The American College of Surgeons Board of Regents would not approve it. This is how much resistance there was, you see. They didn't want to even think about that, you know. This is going to, we'd be sued, this is going to happen. I might say parenthetically that I practiced surgery at least about 60 years because I was able to, the last half of my professional life was spent in vascular surgery. I was right there at the very beginning, the first of everything. The people that I was even trained under were beginning to handle a syphilitic aneurysm of the aorta. You never see those now, but do you know that every patient who came into a hospital in those days had to have a Wassermann test to see whether they had syphilis. There were signs on the street, do not spit on the street. You'd see them all along. Why? Because pulmonary tuberculosis was so prevalent that this is one way to spread it, because the tubercle bacillus has a waxy capsule which protects it, you know. So a lot of things were different. I saw an aneurysm that eroded through the sternum and ruptured, and the patient, of course, died instantly, but the blood hit the wall over the foot of the bed. So how did they treat those? They didn't know how to put an aorta in, or never heard of it. They would wire them. They would fill that aneurysm. They'd have spools of wire and an instrument that would just push all this wire in there to cause a thrombosis and take some of the pressure off the wall of the aneurysm. Well, see, I'm getting down a side track here, but I was talking about the training of residents. Today, I don't think anybody questions that. It's done all over the country and done successfully. I was going to say that in the 60 years I practiced, this is what I would say, I was never sued, never. In New York Hospital, almost every doctor I worked with had 4 or 5 suits hanging over his head in those days. But I was threatened with a suit. One time I'd operated on this woman, and she was getting intravenous saline, and her husband came in and saw this injection bottle. He was horrified. I was trying to poison his wife. So he tried to get a lawyer in Worcester to sue me, and no one would take the case. He went to Boston, went to Wellesley, couldn't get anybody to sue me. So I have never been sued, but I was threatened once. But I'm just saying, and I'm saying this because I was in up to my neck with the use of private patients for surgical residency teaching, you know. Now there was another subject I was going to touch on. Let's cut it for a moment.
Actually,
I better have a drink. I'm an attorney here in Boston. He was the attorney for UMass. No, he was the attorney for the Massachusetts General Hospital. And he was invited up here to talk at the medical school in the early days. This is about 20 years ago. This school, as you know, has had its 25th anniversary. And Brownie Wheeler was the first chairman in the school. And he did a wonderful job. I can't say enough about it. He came in here, every surgeon was worried, how's this going to affect our practice, you know? And he came in here, he set up inter-hospital rounds. We had 5 hospitals in Worcester in those days. And he got us all together. Everybody was reassured. We thought things were improving. In his quiet, knowledgeable way, he led the school in that department. Now, you asked me, what prevents suit? This lawyer from the Mass General has had a lot of experience. He said at one time, you can cut off the wrong leg, and if the patient likes you, they won't sue you. Well, that's a little extreme. Well, but you know, the wrong kidney has been, I saw the threat of taking out the wrong kidney one time, and you say, how could that happen? Well, the patient comes in, the surgeon isn't there, they put him on the operating table, and they're put in a lateral position. And then the patient is scrubbed, put the antiseptic on the skin, and draped. And the surgeon is scrubbing. He comes in, the patient's lying on the side, the operative area is all exposed and draped, but nothing else. You could see how that might happen. I sat on the Joint Commission for Accreditation for Hospitals for a good many years, and I chaired it for a while. We had, I don't know if you know this, well, so many things are popping into my mind right now. How to avoid this? First of all, when an accident happens, that I'm not talking about even giving the wrong drug. The Joint Commission was involved with all these all over the country. So we saw a lot of them. We even saw sexual assault under anesthesia, you know, the worst things you can think about. It's usually not the fault of the doctor. It's the fault of the system under which he operates. It's like an airplane pilot. They are surrounded by a system which is infallible, really, in many respects. If any plane crashes, they spend millions of dollars trying to find out how can we change that system. It isn't how can we get another pilot, but how do we change the system? So for example, with the operation, you see the patient before surgery. Now, surgeons who don't see their patient before surgery, right there are making a great big mistake. The patient's apprehensive. They want that last minute of assurance. Some of them never talk to the patient the day of the operation. They feel deserted. So that's a bad start right there, because then they're on edge and they're looking for other things, and they may find them too. They certainly are going to find a depersonalized system. If you want to be sure of not doing the wrong thing, I think every surgeon should see his patient preferably before they go to the operating room. I used to get in there at 6 o'clock in the morning and talk to the patient, any last minute questions, no, so forth. The orderly may be waiting with a stretcher, but I saw that patient. Then so I know which side we're going to operate on. Then I scrub, and I ask the resident, which side? And if he doesn't know, he's in trouble, But which side? Then I go into the operating room and I ask the anesthesiologist, who is starting the anesthesia or has started it. And I ask any nurse in the room. I have 3 or 4 confirmations of the side that I already know because I asked myself, you see. One time I had a funny experience. They had, in those days, they often had 2 patients in a room with just a curtain between. It was still dark outside in the morning. I went in and I was told this patient was in that room, and I pulled the curtain aside and began talking about the operation to them, asking if there were any questions. And the patient in the next bed said, "Doctor, I'm in here." That's the only time that ever happened to me. But you have to be careful. The care must be personalized, and the patient must feel that you have their best interests at heart. You discuss every aspect of it. You know that there are surgeons today who see the patient once. We'll say a cardiac surgeon. I know I could name names. They see the patient once, never talk to them again. They're taken to the operating room, they operate on them, and they see them once post-operatively and never again. A cardiologist who works with them sees them, That's a little risky. That's a little risky. Patients don't quite understand. Aren't they curious to know how I'm doing, how am I feeling, and so forth? Things like that make it difficult to keep the patient's confidence. And there are many ways in which this can be done. Now, another thing I think is important, many of these go to the intensive care unit. They go right away, often from the recovery room to the intensive care unit. And you see them in the intensive care unit. You've already seen them in the recovery room. And after you've seen them, what do? No matter what hour it is, you go to the telephone and telephone the family. Early morning calls, I've got, we'll say, you operate on a wife, the husband hasn't gone to work yet. To get that call into him before he goes to work and not require that he is trying to reach you at the office, that pays off. The patients will remember that longer than they'll remember anything else, because it isn't done regularly. You know how anxious they are. Well, my granddaughter is getting married this weekend in Boston, and some of the family are driving up for the wedding, and They had a little question about the car coming up. Well, the telephone calls going back and forth. They're worried. Are they going to make it? Are they going to get up here? You know, people need to be informed, because that's a people's skills. And someday we could have a little private conversation about that. What are they? What are some good examples? I'll tell you this much. I can talk to a person for a short period of time, and I can tell whether they have people skills. What are some of the things you look for? You look to see whether they give you eye contact, for one thing, you know, if they're, you know, that's very important. The way they listen, whether they're a good listener or not. Even in a crowded room, that's a real test. In a crowded room, some people can do that, and some are. They draw them to you just by their body language, and this is not an easy thing to acquire. I think some of it has to be genetic. Some of it is dependent on self-esteem. But there's one thing that I think is important, and I've asked many people this. When I've decided this person stands out because they have people skills. It doesn't mean they're the brightest people in the world or know most about it, but they are comfortable with people. And I say this, what can you tell me about your mother? And their face will light up, and they say, oh, I had the most wonderful mother. And to me, that's the source of a lot of people's skills, because women instinctively, I could talk to you a long time about that. I swim 6 days a week at the YWCA, and people's skills are all around the water. Now let's see, what can we talk about? Is the hour up yet?
Well, we can keep.
What?
Sure we have.
If you need a drink.
Hmm?
Do you need a drink?
Do?
Do you want to take a break? We can take a break, or we can
Oh,
keep talking. Or
am I? Oh, I see.
it doesn't matter.
I thought.
And when did you come to Worcester? What was medicine in Worcester like for you?
Why did I come to Worcester? That's a good question, because where you practice is a pretty important decision. Maybe it's as important as whom you marry, you know. There are a lot of things that are very important, and that's one of them. When doctors have to move around, in the corporate world now, this is happening to doctors, you know, they get a bigger, they're losing in the decision-making process. As one writer said, they have ceased to become physicians, they've become employees, you see. Most men and women who go into medicine are attracted by a number of things, but one of them is that they still are in charge, more or less, of their lives, how they're going to work, how they're going to do these things. It's up to them. It isn't up to some manager who tells them what to do. They go, those people who want to be told go into different lines of work. They have different interests. And because of that, I think the profession has attracted, by and large, a pretty fine group of people. Now, as I told you, when I was in medical school, there wasn't one woman in any of the classes. But it's now more women are going into medicine than men. I think it was 55% last year. And I think this is great. And I've told many people, I think in this depersonalized medical system we have, the light at the end of the tunnel is the fact that women are coming in volumes. Now, women know how to personalize things. You know, the scientists tell us that they use both sides of their brain at once, and men only one side. Men focus on an assignment, a duty. They don't want to be interrupted or talk. They want to get that thing done. But women, I've talked to women in crowded rooms, a lot of noise, decibels way up, you know. We're locked in eye to eye. She's dwelling on every word I'm saying. I think I really have this woman's attention. And in the midst of it, she'll swing around and say, no, he didn't say that, to somebody else. She's hearing both at once. I think that's the reason for that is women raising children have got to hear a number of voices at once. There's some explanation. But anyway, they have a personalizing effect. And I never thought I'd hear women or patients say, men say, I want to see a woman doctor. But I'm hearing that now and then. And men will find this out if they don't know it already. They'll sharpen up their efforts, and everybody will benefit. Do you agree with that?
How has medicine in Worcester changed?
Oh, how did I get to Worcester? I'm a Midwesterner transplanted to the East, and I really grew up. I was born in Minnesota, and then a little while in Springfield, Illinois. My father was an Episcopal minister, and we came to Cincinnati when I was about 10 years old, and that's where I grew up. And it was a good experience. It's a different culture there. But when I came to medical school in Boston, I fell in love with New England. But I was offered a job in New York by Dr. Poole to come in as an associate. And that was a temptation because he was at Cornell, he was the leading surgeon in the private service. I had John Barrymore as a patient. I had gangsters who took the most expensive room, $25 a day in those days, you know. I'd come in to make rounds, and he'd have some of his troops lined up. He said, men, meet the doc. And they'd line up like soldiers, and I'd go down and shake hands. He had cancer of the kidney, and he was a coward. But I had a lot of interesting people. We were 6 months on the private service. And Dr. Poole was a famous, fascinating man, and his son became one of the top squash players of the United States, Larry Poole. And I played with him a couple of times just to see how badly he'd beat me. But New York in those days, New York was a much better city than it is now. You know, it wasn't so crowded. And during those 6 months, I had a chance to go out in the evening and meet people and do things. And so I just was thinking about New York. And Lee Kendall was a resident, same year I was. His family ran the Kendall School for Girls. And he had been offered a job in Worcester to start a surgical residency training program at the Worcester City Hospital. And he got a telephone call one night. He was a New Englander, so he knew a lot of people, from a doctor in Framingham. And he said, Lee, he said, we've just had one of our surgeons drop dead from a coronary thrombosis. And he said, we've got an opening here that we won't have again in 10 years. He said, why don't you come down and take it? So Lee came to me and he said, I'm going to take this job. Why don't you go to Worcester and see if you can get the job they offered me? So I got on the train and came up here, and Worcester was quite a different town then. I remember getting lunch at a Thompson's restaurant. They used to be around the country. They had a big arm here, and you sit in a chair and eat off this big arm. And I looked out of the window, and I could see City Hall there. And I thought, this looks, I'd always lived in a big city. This looks like a small town, but it's in a beautiful part of the country, near the mountains, near the ocean, near everything. And so I went out to the hospital, and here I'd been in this brand new hospital. We saw the first patients that ever went into the New York Cornell Medical Center, you know. Oh, incidentally, while we were residents, we did all our own lab work. They had a lab on every floor, and we learned how to do those tests, too. They don't do that anymore. We had our own dining room with a printed menu every day, 18th floor overlooking the East River. People invite us to dinner, we'd say, why don't you come have dinner with us? You know, it was that nice. We could do that. Well, I got there, and this hospital, the Worcester City Hospital, had all yellow woodwork, you know. It was an old hospital. And it looked pretty primitive to me after being in the new hospital. But anyway, I decided I'll take it. I'll spend a year here, and if I like it, I'll stay. Well, so I took the job from starting the residency. And that in itself was a very stimulating thing because the young men that I came in contact with were just fine fellows. And I liked the slower pace in Worcester. I began to meet people here, and I liked them. And then on our teaching rounds, now and then we'd get physicians from Memorial Hospital to come in and talk to us, specialists, you know, talk to the staff. And it didn't take me long to realize that the men at Memorial were better trained, the type of men whom I was more accustomed to than at the city hospital. The city hospital had 4 surgical services then and 4 chiefs. And they would take it for 4 months. Does that come out right anyway? 3 or 4 months. I'm not a mathematician. And then the next man would come on. These are surgeons, head of a staff. One of the chief surgeons, in the whole time he was on, never did one single operation on any private patient. He did have a patient who came with a fractured rib, and he treated by encircling the entire chest with tape, so the guy could hardly breathe, you know. But I was seeing things like that. So I decided if I could get an appointment at Memorial Hospital, I'd stay. I went over there and got acquainted with some of the trustees and doctors. And so I wrote a letter and asked for an appointment, and they gave it to me. And I decided to stay here, where I've been ever since.
What changes have you seen in Worcester? What changes have you seen in Worcester?
In Worcester? Well, I've seen a lot of changes. One of the first important changes occurred when Brownie Wheeler came here. Before that, we hardly knew the surgeons at the other hospitals. Some were well trained, some weren't. Some of them were very small hospitals, very modest amounts of surgery were being done, and so forth. All of them were very suspicious of this new group coming here. So Brownie Wheeler organized general surgical rounds for all 5 hospitals, and that we would hold the rounds in each hospital in succession, you see. 1 week here, another week there. And the surgeons at that hospital would present the cases, and we'd discuss them, and we got to know each other better, and we formed the Worcester Surgical Society, and that played an important role. We'd have a dinner once a month together, and so we developed a little community spirit, as it were, and we found there were some very fine men on the staff of other hospitals. Before, they were isolated units, more or less, you know. So that was one of the major changes. Then, of course, the hospitals began to grow, get bigger, and we had the Massachusetts Medical Society held their 1 annual meeting here, few years after, it has never been held any place but Boston before, and it hasn't been held here since until the school was built. And now specialty societies are meeting here. So it's just growing and improving. The school has been a wonderful thing for the city. They've had a number of chancellors since the beginning. They've all done a good job. One was a disaster, and he didn't stay very long. But other than that, it's been growth, and it's been more of a challenge. Now we're getting a little too crowded. We're the second biggest in Massachusetts, of course. And, the airport. We used to all fly out of the Worcester airport, but then we had to fly out of Providence for a while, and Hartford, and so I saw parking in Providence used to be in a big field with grass all over it, you know. They had no parking garage there, but they had 8 or 10 national airlines flying in there. Worcester never had more than 2, and there are a lot of reasons for that. There used to be a farm, a hill, and they just cut the top of the hill off and made an airport out of it. Then they had problems with fog when other places didn't, and they had to fly. It's still, that's another story.
They just opened up, I think American Airlines just opened
Yes.
up the route there.
I think American Eagle, isn't it? Yeah. I think I just learned that I've flown, I'm on my second 1,000,000 miles with American just since their Advantage program has started, so I know American quite well. And I heard the other day that the American Eagle is a company that American has contracted with. It's apparently aren't under quite the same administration. I don't know if that's true or not, but I heard that. How's our time going? We're up, aren't we?
Yeah, we should wrap up. Just in closing, can you say what advice would you have for younger doctors today?
Well, first of all, I think you have to like your job. If you don't like it, you won't do a good job. If you don't like people, you ought to get into something else. If people interest you, if you're interested in psychology, I think when I was in school, knowing I'd have to take a lot of science in medical school, I majored in philosophy and minored in psychology. Took as little science as I could, and it helped. I still find psychology very interesting, why people behave as they do, you know, and what their motivations are, and it helps with the patients. But so that's the first thing. And if I had the chance to advise a very young person, I'd say, even though you're a teenager, get some sort of job that gets you in a hospital, whether it's raking leaves or running errands. Even it used to be a little easier to get jobs like that than it is now. But it's hard to get people to do anything now with our current economy. But if you could get something that would give you exposure, even as a volunteer, so that you can sample the flavor of hospital life. I remember that you'll be amused by this, but when I was quite young, I was living in Springfield, Illinois, and the man who I admired so was our doctor, a general practitioner who did some minor surgery, and he's a great friend of my family's. And he owned and ran a tuberculosis sanitarium. Well, those were all around the country, you know, in those days. So he knew that I was interested in being a doctor simply because I liked him, and he was a doctor. So he said to my family one summer, he said, "Do you think George would like to have a job at the sanitarium to get a little of the flavor?" And they thought I would, and I jumped at it. I thought it was a wonderful idea. And so the first day, he took me into the examining room. I wish I remember how I was in my teens. And he introduced me to the patient, and he said, "Now I'll give you a pad of paper, and you can take little notes that would explain your presence in the room, you know, this patient with tuberculosis." So I sat down on a stool, and he talked to the patient, and then he'd make a comment to me. "This patient is so many years old," and I'd write that down. And then he would listen to the chest, and he said, "Apical valves on the right side." I said to him, for the patient, "How do you spell Ralphs?" And anyway, he decided that maybe I was not quite ready for the clinical room. He said, "I'm going to get you a job with Sam." Now, Sam was a farmhand who had a horse and took care of the grounds. So my assignment then was to ride around with Sam and help him, and I got interested in the horse, you know, and I used to groom the horse. And I'd get in and out of the sanitarium just as an observer occasionally. But that was my initial. From then on, I got a job, as I said, during the urinalysis in one of the hospitals. But if you can find out if you like it. If you like something, I don't care what it is, you'll do a good job with it. So many people have to do things they don't like to do. Then the next thing is, I think, you need to like people. And you need to feel easy in their presence. You know, I think people who are not easy in the presence of other people have either gotten that from their parents, or they've had some experiences growing up that damaged them, their self-esteem, or there are a whole variety of reasons. But I think if you feel happy with people, now I'm thoroughly enjoying my visit with you, you know. This is a treat for me, because you're both smart, you're listening. You stimulate me. I'd talk all day if you'd listen. I read the other day that a writer said, "You know, our life is divided into 4 quarters. He said, "We know a great deal about the first 3 quarters. We study for them, we work, we produce, we do a pretty good job." But he said, "We know nothing about the 4th quarter. And the worst part of it is the people in the 4th quarter aren't talking." So I decided if anybody will stand still 10 minutes, I'll tell them about the 4th quarter.
Well, thank you so much for visiting with us.
Been a